Welcome to this video about SPIFFE and SPIRE. My name is Whitney Lee. I'm a developer advocate, and I'm here with Volkan. Will you introduce yourself, please?
My name is Volkan, and I am a developer.
So, as part of the show that I have called Enlightening, and we spent almost 2 hours with Volkan teaching me about SPIFFE and SPIRE, which I knew nothing before today, and now I know this much stuff. So, Volkan, the way we started our conversation 2 hours ago was I asked you, what was the world like before SPIFFE existed that needed it to get created?
So before SPIFFE existed, the secure communication between workloads was always a thing. So workloads used to communicate with either service tokens or via MTLS to establish secure communication. There are issues with both of those, like service tokens. If you have a token, you need to store it. And us being lazy developers, we were baking those tokens to the images, which is not the most secure way. That was one issue. And for certificates, the issue was they were imported cryptographic materials. So rotating them, expiring them, distributing them was a problem, which is solved by, like, typically you can have a public key infrastructure that solves it, but in a cloud native way, you need a more flexible PKI, where SPIRE comes in.
And it's a lot of work, it sounds like. So
it is.
SPIFFE stands for Secure Production Identity Framework for Everyone. I love the "for everyone" at the end. It makes me feel included.
If you're a designer, developer, accountant, you can use SPIFFE. Yeah. If you're a workload or like a person, like it's technically for everyone. Yeah.
So it's a standard for securing two things: securing and identifying workloads in a production environment. And so then we have a counterpart, SPIRE, which stands for SPIFFE Runtime Environment. And SPIRE is a reference implementation, the most popular one for SPIFFE. So one thing you explained to me that I'm going to say back to you is that when we think about two workloads that are talking to each other, we're worried about their identity, but we're also worried about what they want to do. And then those things together make up a policy. So SPIFFE specifically is helping with the identity part of that. The action in terms of what they want to do and the policy itself, that's probably going to be managed by some sort of policy framework, like Open Policy Agent, for example.
Identity is like the authorization part, and the action is the authentication part. Action is more friendlier than authentication. So
let's talk about this part of the board where we talked about, like, why are we identifying processes as opposed to adding identity to machines?
In a cloud native stack, you can add identity to every layer, but the closer you come to the middle, the more rigid your identity will be. So in a machine, you can use like VM ID and machine ID, but in a cross-cloud environment, one VM ID might not play well with another VM's ID. At the machine layer, it's not the best way to put identity. First of all, it is like too broad, not granular anyway. So like a machine can have many hosts or many processes on it that might need to be separately identified instead of machine itself. The one level above is like identifying the host, and you can identify host by its IP address. But again, in a cloud native environment, IPs are changed, churned, and establishing communication from one IP to another will require defining your firewall rules, network address translation rules, and whatnot. So that would mean that, it's lots of, juggling at the host layer. At that point, you end up having a step back and thinking, what am I identifying? Like, I am not identifying hosts because I don't want to say this host can talk to this host. I want to say this application in this host can talk to or cannot talk to this application on the other hosts. We essentially want to dispatch identities to apps, but so far before SPIRE, what we typically ended up was dispatching those certificates or IDs or whatnot to hosts themselves instead of applications, because dispatching a per application identity at scale was something of a challenge which SPIFFE solves.
So we're adding the identity at the process layer. We talked about a SPIFFE ID, which is a standard for formatting this ID, like it looks like a URL. And then we talked about this very important concept called SVID, which stands for SPIFFE Verifiable Identity Documents. But we can think of an SVID as a passport or like a driver's license for a process.
The way it is done is like there's a workload API, and the workload API is unprotected by design, because when the workload brings itself up, it doesn't have anything to claim what it is to be. So it cannot securely talk to a workload API. So by definition, the workload API that the workload gets is its identity, its passport, which is SVID, is not protected. Workload, finds the workload API and asks, hey, I just came to life. I don't know my name. Who am I? And it's like just, having an amnesia moment, I guess. So like, I am here. This is the room. Like, what's my purpose? What I'm doing? Which is a bigger question, but it's a side topic, I guess. And the workload.
Sorry, workload. You're never gonna figure it out.
Yeah, it will take your entire lifetime. What the workload API does is to query what's around the workload. It can be the hypervisor, it can be the kubelet, Kubernetes API, or it can be the kernel, operating system kernel. It can ask, the process ID of the workload, the user group of the workload, or it can do a mixture of both to identify and verify that the workload is what it claims to be. Similar to, as a real life analogy, and if you go to passport, like you don't just go to DMV and, hey, can I get a passport? My name is this. You have to, the DMV has to prove that you are yourself, and it will ask, stuff from you, like a birth certificate, or a picture, or a driver's license, or whatnot. By extension, it verifies that you are yourself by things around you, rather than a secret passphrase that you and the DMV knows already, because that won't work, that won't scale. That's the overall how workload API works, I guess.
So, and then when we talk about the workload API, for me, it helps me to kind of understand like how the software is running and what's running where and what components there are. So that's when we talked about like a SPIRE server, and it talks to a SPIRE agent. So the SPIRE server, so now we're talking about SPIRE, not SPIFFE.
Yes.
We're talking about SPIRE. It's typically, in Kubernetes, it would be a stateful set. And this is, it's going to be the software that stores and distributes these SVID. And then on each host machine in Kubernetes, we have a SPIRE agent. And so that's going to be a daemon set. And it receives SVIDs from the server, and then it's the piece of software that exposes that workload API that you've been talking about. And so the SPIRE agent is what the thing that's doing the work, verifying the workload, and then giving out the SVID.
SPIRE agent exposes that workload API by opening a Linux domain socket that all of the workloads can attach to that domain socket by essentially mounting a volume, connecting to that socket. And that helps make the communication faster between the agent and the workload, I guess.
So a new process is born. So they go to the workload API, which is part of the SPIRE agent, and they say, I need an SVID. The workload API is going to do stuff like it might query the kubelet, it might query the OS, it might look at the SHA. This part of it is configured when you set up SPIFFE and SPIRE.
Yes.
This is set up by the user. So there's a plugin system. You could say, I want to use this plugin and use this method of verification before the SPID is issued in my system.
It's two-part. Like one of them is like the plugin system, and the other is registering those identities. In Kubernetes, there are controllers that can do it automatically, which is cluster SPIFFE ID is an abstraction that if you define that, you can assign IDs to workloads inside a cluster. And there's also a cluster federated trust domain abstraction that does federation between your clusters and dispatching IDs across clusters. But if you don't have those, things that you can let the orchestrator automate it, then you'll have to personally, as an operator, register the ID. You need to say, hey, we are expecting a baby, it's due soon, and the baby will be in this hospital, and his or her name will be this one. We are expecting the nurse of that baby to be this person, and the baby has something on her ankle, like a birthmark or something. But with those, you can assure that the baby is the baby it claims to be. Yeah.
So that's how that part of it works. And then once that is complete, the workload API issues that SVID. Also happens is the workload API is going to like do all the work of managing the SVID. So that includes rotating, revoking, distributing, compartmentalizing this SVID. And another cool thing about the SVID is that it's short-lived. You said by default it lives for 1 day, but if you want it to live for a shorter amount of time, it can live for a shorter amount of time.
It's a trade-off as usual. Like shorter the time, the more compute you need because you need to rotate and distribute and all those stuff more frequently than a day.
So then the idea is in the WHO, like if 2 workloads each have an SVID, and the policy says yes, then that means those 2 workloads can communicate with each other now. SPIFFE is a secure and an automated way to manage identity.
Like one of the benefits is like it's really battle tested. Lots of companies use it. Google want to use SPIFFE as a cloud identity control plane, which is great for the project and also for other projects that leverage SPIFFE because more people will start contributing to the project, including official contributors from those big companies, which will really help. And also it is used at scale. It can scale up to millions of nodes and it still works. Another thing is kind of abstracts all of this complexity of the rotation, distribution, revoking, whatnot. So as a workload, you don't have to think about all those. Somebody gives you a certificate and from your perspective, it's what matters. And there are various SDKs for Golang, for Python, for Rust, for Java that you can leverage and directly talk to this workload API programmatically and keep your SVIDs up to date. And if you don't want to do it, there are sidecars and helpers that does it for you as well in a containerized environment.
We talked about the fact that you can manage identity cross-cloud and cross-platform.
It aligns with, many people's vision. Anything, anywhere vision can be established by, this kind of identity management solution. So you don't need secrets because there are no secrets. But I say it as a caveat because sometimes you still need to deal with or integrate with secret stores. And SPIFFE and by extension SPIRE allows that ability. So you can use SPIFFE certificates or like SVIDs. There are ways to talk to secret stores, which I kind of do on a day-by-day basis as well. And also like great community support.
Great community, yes. All right, thank you so much for sharing your time and your expertise with me today, Volkan. And thank
My
you,
pleasure.
those of you who watched the video to the end. I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful day. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.